Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second day of Culturama. We're going on all this month, all the month of November on Fridays and Saturdays from 9 a.m. until 7 p.m. So please join us. Today, we have a great lineup. We're going to start with Tobi Harper, and then I'm going to my schedule here. Oh, geez, I put my schedule down. Okay. Start off with Tobi Harper, and then we go to Linda Smith Hogan, and she's the former sex education professor at Mount SAC, and now she's a full-time writer. So she's going to tell you how to write about sex. Then we have Kareem Tayar, and he's going to talk about writing era-specific fiction. Kareem Tayar is, I think, the most joyful person I've ever met in my life, and he's a great person to learn from. And then our keynote reading tonight is going to be Romaine Washington and Stephanie Barbet-Hammer, who were here yesterday, and they're going to do readings and take our questions. Okay, so I'm so absolutely thrilled to have Tobi Harper here today. Tobi is an editor for Red Hen Press, and I guess you're the managing editor for Quill. How would you say that?
Oh, just the founder and editor. It's an imprint. If we have time, I'll go into the difference between a publishing house, imprints, and I'll do a brief overview on what the difference is. But yeah, editor of Quill and deputy director and an editor for Red Hen.
And she works with my former student, Monica Fernandez, who is doing just a great things at Red Hen. Red Hen and Quill 2, I think, is a great place to learn how to be a part of the literary world, right? They do internships and that sort of thing. And they are the one place in Los Angeles, as far as I know, where you can really learn to be a professional editor. And even if what you want eventually is to be a writer, that's a really great thing to know. So, Tobi.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Monica's fantastic. In fact, she applied because you told her to. So thank you. Yeah, yeah, Monica is fantastic. She actually just threw a really big, amazing event with our New Moons anthology. She managed to pull off a 23 contributor hour-and-a-half event over Zoom, which was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is just to be clear, this hour-and-a-half talk is something that I also teach over a 10-week class. So I'm going to go through as good as an overview as I can. And then, of course, I will try to be fast enough that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you hear my dogs in the background, just ignore that. They're fine. They're being taken care of by someone else right now. Okay, so just to start, in terms of the role of the editor, actually, before we do that, I wonder if y'all use your reactions much. If you know how to use your reactions in the bottom of it, can you? Yeah, cool. Thanks, Barry. Would y'all give me a thumbs up if you're, I'm going to put 3 categories. You can have all of them or none of them, but writers, editors, or publishing professionals. Okay. So if you want to be an editor when you grow up, put up your thumbs or whatever. Just want to get a general idea. Okay. Couple editors. All right, great. How about writers? Cool, lots more. I'm gonna see if Perry and Tommy put them back up. Okay, writers. Cool, lots of writers. Okay, anyone who's really who's also looking to be just a publishing professional, whether that's in marketing, whatever. Cool, hold that. All right, awesome. Any level of publishing. Okay, cool. Okay, great. Then I will just give a nice well-rounded perspective on lots of everyone from every side. Okay, so the briefest way to say what's happened with editors, I'll say editors then and now, right? So the editors then are sort of editors pre-internet, I'll say. I don't know if that's really the official delineation, but I think it kind of is. Pre-internet, authors were sent on really big, long tours, right? You see that in movies. People are put up first-class tickets, hotel rooms. They go around and have these massive tours that everyone thinks of. Those, I like to call those the editors of the 70s. That does not really happen anymore. In order to get that kind of preferential treatment, not only do you need to be with a big 5 press, but you need to be the 1% of those big 5 publications, because they're really only investing that level of I guess, budget towards those 1% authors. And keep in mind, I mean, this is insanely expensive. And the turnaround, the thing is that the turnaround for events is really, people think of it as like as selling books, which of course it is. But on the smaller scale, unless you're Michelle Obama, right, filling out 10,000 people stadiums, for the most part, really what you're getting is a 30-person event. You know, maybe 20 to 30 people, maybe up to 50 or 100 if it's really well planned at a big spot like Romans in Pasadena. But for the most part, what you're really doing is connecting with booksellers. Like the author wants to get there early, be helpful, be nice, you know, set things up. Like what you're really doing is making a connection and building on a relationship with that bookseller. So book tours are weirdly now far more about publicity and about relationships than they are about hard selling books. And that is one of the examples of how being the editor has really changed over the years. You know, like back in the before times, editors worked with authors over really long periods of time. They were way more deeply connected with them and their career as a writer. Now agents have really taken that place in a lot of ways. An agent does, you know, considers each project from their clients, from their authors, but also is really looking at the whole author's career. And the editor at the publishing house is really, their job is really to produce winning titles. And at a smaller company, they're really focusing on also following those titles through to their success, because if you pick a title and you want it to do well, of course, that editor wants to follow it through, make sure the marketing copy is good, that their cover design does well, so that the book sells well enough to justify them having acquired it. So the smaller the company, the more that the editor is going to do a huge amount of things, right? Like even if you have a 3-person publishing company, one of them is going to be the editor, and they're sort of going to become the catch-all. Right? There's going to be an editor. Like when you start off a publishing company, you need an editor for editorial aesthetic. You need a designer, right? Somebody who's going to design and create the whole book, which is way more complicated than some people realize. And then hopefully you also have somebody who knows anything about business. Some people skip that part at first, but I do recommend it from the start. So as you can imagine, if you've got one person designing all the books, one person managing all the business, that, you know, hopefully one person managing all the business, that editor is going to be doing a lot of work, including acquiring, editing, marketing, you know, promoting, all of that. Yeah, so just to start off, tips and tricks for anybody who wants to succeed in publishing. I really recommend this for editors, writers, really everyone. I'll go through them quickly. If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I am happy to pause in the moment. Otherwise, I'll leave them at the end. So number one, and that's really what this whole thing is about, especially as an editor, you really want to be a jack of all trades, and of course also an expert in your own specialty, but you really want to get the best idea of the whole publishing industry as you can. The publishing is complicated, and as an editor, you really want to know what everyone's doing in each department in order to really successfully you know, work with the company, or work with, you know, if you want to self-publish, then of course you want to know what every department would otherwise be doing without you, right? So it's very important to be able to know that all the way through. This is the most important thing you could possibly do, is just read all the time. The whole like fear of influence thing, like ignore that. That is not real. You have to read. Read your favorite genres, your least favorite, listen to audiobooks, poetry in your bedside table, short stories by the bathtub, whatever it takes, whatever genres fit in what. You want to, yeah, right. So for me, I have like different stuff I read as an audiobook, different stuff I read sitting down, you know, I've like learned that personal preference. And I did not love audiobooks to start with, I will say. I had to just like coconut water. I couldn't really drink coconut water, so I started pineapple flavored. Now I like coconut water. So with audiobooks, I had to start off weirdly with really action-oriented sci-fi, and that kind of got me into audiobooks. I don't know. Read YAs, even if you don't specifically like YAs, they're really, really well talked about. So it's handy to at least be up to date on the big ones, right? You can skim, obviously, you don't have to read everything perfectly and thoroughly. You're not being graded on it. You can skim through it, but just like consume as much literature as you can. Check books out of libraries. There's an app called Libby that is just, I'm going to write it down. It's so amazing. Okay, Libby. All right, there's also Overdrive, but I feel like their interface is not really it's not quite as clean and helpful as Libby. Libby's fantastic. You can get ebooks, audiobooks, all for free. Yeah, John, what's up? Yeah, now you're stuck on mute.
Is that so you can check things out in the library using Libby, or is that just
Yeah.
general? Okay.
No, Libby's for library. So basically you sort of set your local library, and you can like check out anything. Like I'm listening to The Stand by Stephen King, and like, it's not always perfectly available. It's a library, but you'll put it on hold and it'll pop up and say like, hey, your hold on The Stand by Stephen King is now ready to listen to. And then you click borrow, and then you listen to it for the next, whatever it was, 28 days or something. And then you have to renew it. Most books that aren't 47 hours long, you can finish in one borrow. But I will say The Stand is taking a bit. It's the version that's 15% longer than the original, so it's pretty long. But yeah, Libby, highly recommend. And also free, right? You can't like, you could really break the bank trying to read all the time if you're buying it yourself. But also very important, you will never read enough. Whatever enough is, you're not going to get there. So just enjoy yourself, read. Or maybe I should say whatever you read is enough. You are not better or worse than any other reader for what you have or have not read. Everybody here has a different top 10 than everyone else here. Everyone else had everyone's going to have a book that's, oh my God, how did you not read fill in the blank? And you've got one too. Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Because I like to listen to audiobooks too, but I like to read as well, but I'm kind of a slow reader. But I have a real hard time just tossing the book or the audiobook away when it's crap. I just have to keep thinking it's going to be good. And there's so much to read out there. And when I find something really good, I read it really, really slowly because it's so beautiful. But do you have any tips on how to not, as a publisher, you must have to just discard a lot of things that you read.
Yeah, I do actually. That is that's one of my favorite topics to bring up in a crowded group of readers. Is when do you stop? I have a coworker who she has no rules. If she's 3 pages in and she hates it, she's done. She puts it away. I am not that discerning. I would say I really want to like every book that I'm reading. I really want to find what it is, because I have a pretty good spread of books that I like. My hard rule is at this point 50%, and that's a deep investment. That's a super deep investment. But I would say at the very least, I think 50% is a good max limit. If you are halfway through it and you just can't stand it, it's not going to save itself in the last half. You're just not enjoying it. Just stop while you're ahead. Don't invest that much time over again. That's my hard rule. A lot of people have just a guideline. You'll sort of get a sense within the first chapter. Do you know if you like it? There's some. If you ever read The Sheltering Sky by Paul Bowles, once you've read the first chapter, you're in. You cannot stop. So yeah, I would say somewhere between the first chapter and halfway through. I think first chapter is a fair bet. Like a pilot, any show. If you really want to try out a show, you got to go past the pilot. So I don't know. I'd say chapter 1 or 2 at least. As a guideline. Everyone has their own, they're all guidelines. Everything I will ever say in publishing, it's all case by case. It's all according to the publisher, the author, the book, the time, pre-pandemic, mid-pandemic, post-pandemic. The amount of case by case is mind-boggling. But if you just have a general overview, you can sort of figure it all out as you go.
Yeah, I have a hard time overcoming my guilt at doing that. No,
totally.
They couldn't have gotten published. How did it get published if it's so bad?
And
some of them are really popular. One example is 50 Shades of Grey. I thought that was the worst writing I'd ever read in my life.
Well, it was fanfic, so fair enough. But also to say that lots of things start as fanfic. It's really all about preference, right? For some people, okay, 50 Shades of Grey, Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, right? These are books that some people are oh, it's not real poetry, oh, it's not real literature. And first of all, real is relative, right? But also it got people into it. Harry Potter saved a whole generation from slipping off into no books land. 50 Shades of Grey maybe pulled a bunch of people into reading more. Reading at all is pretty great. And Rupi Kaur, brought a ton of people into poetry. So God, bless that. Yeah, it is. The guilt is there, but there are enough books in this world. Everyone's got their own preferences, right? Even cake. Some people hate chocolate cake. It's all good, right? More chocolate cake for other people. Yeah, I would say try. I mean, I get that, the feeling of guilt. But I would say my general rule is if I really don't like a book and there's no good reason for it, I at least don't rate it that way, right? Like if you're going to go on Goodreads, don't give it a 2-star, like, oh, I just didn't like it. You know, give it a 2-star because it was a bad book or something. But as long as you're fair in your assessment of it, if it is publicly posted, I think that's what matters. Yeah, so anyway, so you can't ever read enough, right? Just read whatever you can all the time. Also, of course, learn how to use technology. Like really, it is a really like I've had authors submit books to me that had been written on a typewriter, and they said specifically like, I cannot email, I cannot use my computer. And that is not an author, like that is, we do not have the level of support necessary to support that kind of manuscript development, right? Like, first of all, it is a typewritten book. That means somebody's going to have to handwrite all that into a computer, like just to start, right? Not even delving into what else would have to be done to support that sort of thing. So learn technology, learn how to attach a file to an email. Like I realize this is basics, but really like be a pro at that. If you want to learn design, you've got to learn Adobe InDesign. If you want to do interiors, you have to learn Adobe InDesign. If you want to do covers, you could also learn Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop, but for interior designing, Adobe InDesign is where it's at. Of course, also learn how to use Google Drive, Microsoft Word track changes. Don't be the editor who gives your edits in all caps because you don't know how to do track changes. It's aggressive. It makes us sad. Yeah. Learn how to do technology. Also in that, learn how to do social media. I'll talk more on that later if we have time. But promote other ways you want to be, promote other people the way that you want to be promoted. And that means professionally, right? Keep your social media clean, keep their social media clean. Don't pop up a picture of somebody smoking or drinking. It's just like, there's no reason for it. It certainly can't help. Unless their book is about drinking or smoking, then go ahead. Right. If it is on the internet, consider it to have been published on First Page News. Even if it's up for a second, somebody can screenshot it, send it to the Wayback Machine, and then everybody forever will have that image or that post or whatever it is. And also make your own rules. Make sure your friends know your rules, right? Like if you know, I never want a picture of myself smoking or drinking or wearing a red shirt because it makes my color look wrong. Make sure all your friends know that, right? Yeah. Right, have your own rules, make sure your friends know them. Like I've had a friend call me and be like, hey, somebody just posted something inappropriate on your Facebook wall, and I immediately went on and I deleted it, right? Because we have that sort of established. Next, go to literary events and meet your community. Is very important. If you want to get published, if you want to be part of publishing, you've got to support the community. And that also means learning about other publishing companies, right? There are almost 30 in Los Angeles alone, probably more at this point. Some of them do letterpress publishing, some of them are ebook only, some of them are romance only or fantasy only, which means like maybe you haven't heard of all of them because they're not in your niche. But each has their own specific specialty, passion, or mission. You know, there's all different kinds of publishers. All right. Also, obviously, be a critical thinker, but really consider the big picture about the author's career, about the whole publishing company as a whole. And you're also thinking about each author and project within the season, within the year. So, right, you're representing like an author in a book, but you're also representing that author and book within a whole season that has to have sort of a vibe, and also the whole year, which of course reflects your entire list as a publishing company. So you've really got to be thinking about that all at once. So when you're acquiring a book or when you're trying to get your book acquired, right? If a publishing company does short story, poetry, and novels, they're not just randomly picking among them. They're trying to get like a third of that. They want a third of that year to be poetry, you know, a few of them to be short stories, a bunch of them to be novels. So you got to have a balance of where the profits are going to come in. Because I will tell you, as much as we love it, it will not come from the poetry. The poetry is the passion that we get the profitable books in order to balance, right? And this one should be obvious, but please be nice. This is a very small world. Everyone knows each other. Be kind and respectful to people or they will not want to work with you. This is a passion-based industry. There's no financial reward for putting up with mean people or people who make your life or your work difficult. All right. Any authors who, if anyone ever sends me an email and I'm wincing when I see their name, like that is not what anybody wants. You want them to be like, yes, Sarah Stone just emailed me, I'm in. I want to read this email, right? You don't want them to wince and avoid it for the next 3 days. And also, yeah, just don't pick people who are going to, oh yeah, Mary.
Hi, Toby. Going back to, you mentioned there are 30 publishers in LA alone. Number one, is there a place where I could go to find them? And is that important as far as geographically? I mean, now that, we have the internet and we could publish all over the world, and like, what's the advantage of having these local?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so I mentioned, that's a good point. I mentioned there are 30 in Los Angeles just to say that I think some people think like, oh, there's only a few, and there's really 30 plus, like even in Los Angeles, which is thought of as like not necessarily a literary city, although I think it really is becoming one. What are the advantages? That is a good question though. What are the advantages? The advantages are, well, for instance, I was just saying that our next, so I founded our Quill Awards series, which publishes a queer author every year. And this next one coming out in the spring is from a local author in Los Angeles. And because we're in Los Angeles, that means I'm gonna be able to plug them into a bunch of local events, like local events where our staff will be available to be there in person. Like, so when we do a launch, like I will be there. I can actually be there without a, $1,000+ trip to like go somewhere just to be for somebody's launch event, which typically you wouldn't do at a smaller press, not even at a bigger press, right? I mean, keep in mind, it's like, oh, it's just a trip, but that's $1,000 to $2,000 that's not going to have any return on that investment besides just saying hello. So I'd say like that's one of them. You're right, it's the internet. Most of our authors are not local. It is kind of, it's a bonus, right? Like if you're dating someone who also knows how to give great massages, it's a bonus, it's not a requirement. It's just really nice. Yeah. No, I would say I've been sort of keeping a list, which unfortunately some of them, a couple of them we lost in the pandemic, or rather a couple of them I should say got absorbed during the pandemic by other ones, so they're still alive. So it is ever changing, but really it's about, I mean, the thing is like, sure, there's a whole list, but like, some of them are photography publishers, some of them are cookbook publishers. Like you really like, publishing is about finding like your publisher, your publishing niche, almost like, like dating, like you're looking for like your type, really. You're looking for your type, they're looking for their type, and like that's really what you're doing when you're looking for acquisition or to get your books published. So that matters more than anything. Yeah, be nice, right? So in terms of being nice, just for context, a book project can take 3 years or more, depending on whether the book's life keeps on going and you keep promoting it. So just keep in mind, 3 years, that is a long time to consistently work with someone, every week or every month. And that was part of why it's really important. And it's also important to have boundaries, compartmentalize your time, make sure you're not working all the time, or you will lose it. And then, of course, go be a good literary citizen, be the champion you wish you had, write reviews on Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon, share your friends' events, make comments in the chat when you're on an event, not this one, no pressure. I mean, like when you're at a book launch event. Get the book signed, right? If you want a book, go up to the author, look them in the eye, tell them they're amazing, get the book signed. They love it more than you can imagine. Especially if there's 2 lines and one's shorter, pick the short line. They really could use it. Yeah, we are a literary community, especially in the indie community, but really books in general. We rise and fall together. So like anything you're doing, like I heard someone once say like, oh, I don't check out books from the library because I feel like I'm not supporting the book industry. It all supports the book industry. Every checkout at a library is a checkout in the favor of that publisher and is more likely to get their books, purchased by that library in the future. And libraries also, of course, affect each other. In fact, depending on the state, if one library buys it, all the libraries in that state buy it. So that's not California, but I think like Maine might be one of those, right? Probably Delaware. Yeah. Let's see, public speaking. Public speaking is super helpful. Just there's things you can do. Dale Carnegie used the expensive version, but amazing and highly recommended. The super affordable local version is the Toastmasters Club. If you've not heard of that, it's important enough that I will just put it here. Toastmasters Club, that is basically a very quick description, is that they meet usually like once or twice a month. And it's basically just a group of people, of like professionals in your area who are looking to be better at public speaking. So it's really just speech practice. They like give you a whole handbook. You like pay to sort of sign up. I think some sort of nominal fee just for the text, the books that you follow along in. It's like $3 a week to go altogether. But really, it's just a whole group of people who put a huge dedicated amount of time into helping you with public speaking. Everyone takes turns, like writing speeches, like one step at a time. First, you talk about yourself, but it's just amazing. Even if you only do it for a year, if you're at all worried about public speaking, I highly recommend it. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And then of course there's recommended books. I can go through more of these, but my best recommended ones, this is great, before and after the book deal. I'll drop some of these in the chat. But before and after the book deal, what editors do, Peter Gina, this one is fantastic. Of course, get the most recent copy of Chicago Manual of Style. You can do that digitally as well at this point, because they do update them now and then. It doesn't have to be the most updated one. But it should be at least the last couple versions, and of course, like, you know, updated at least to the point that titles are in italics and not underlined. And then for publishing business in general, this one is fantastic, literally called The Publishing Business, and I recommend the second edition. The first edition came out about 10 or 12 years ago, and is you know, the publishing industry changes fast. So editors kind of do everything. Sometimes if they're at a really big press, and they're like really only the acquisitions editor, maybe that's the only thing they do. It's pretty unlikely. And even if they are, so the acquisitions editor, literally, that's like the classic thing everyone thinks of, right? Like manuscripts. That was actually in 50 Shades of Grey, right? She's like, oh, I'm an editor now. And they like put manuscripts on her desk, and all she has to do is just read them and see if she likes them. And that is super cute and doesn't happen anymore. But maybe, you know, in a way, at the biggest 5 press, if you are the editor. And even if that was the case, you're not just reading them and saying, oh, I like it, let's take a chance on this. You're reading them, and then you're getting a whole marketing, you know, sheet on them. You're getting a whole media sheet on them. What have they done? What have they published? What are the words that they want? What are they doing now? What is their job? Where do they live? Where have they lived? You're like thinking about the whole tour, all of the little footprints they have, and how that's going to affect the promotion of their book. So even the quote simplest version that people think of, you still have to consider so much. And you're also figuring out a balance of your profit projects with the passion projects, right? So 50 Shades of Grey paid for a lot of poetry to get published that year. I mean, that's sort of jokingly, but really, right? When Jill Bialowski, poetry editor at Norton, is choosing her books, she has to choose big ones that aren't necessarily like getting big. Higher sale does not always mean higher quality of literature, right? Like we were talking about, you know, again, 50 Shades of Grey, lots of opinions there, but I think in terms of like, is it the next Ulysses? Probably not, right? But really high sales. And so that's the sort of balance an editor has to do. It's not all like books you love. It's hopefully books you like that sell a lot of money, and books you love that don't sell as much money, but still inform. The books that don't sell as much, but are still higher quality, are still the ones that inform the sort of aesthetic direction of the press. That sounds sort of odd. You think the bestsellers are the ones that really inform it, but the bestsellers are really the ones that just serve to allow everyone, all the other books to like exist, sort of. Sometimes we call them tent poles, call them lead titles, you call them tent poles, and the tent poles, of course, meaning like that is the pole that keeps up the rest of the season and really allows everything else to have room. Yeah, so what do you acquire, right? It's all about, here, sorry. Cool. So in terms of what do you acquire, right? What is your editorial aesthetic? That is most important thing every editor's got to know, right? Is it, you know, if you're at Les Fig, it is only lesbian poetry, right? If you are at Copper Canyon, it's only poetry. If you are at, you know, Lewin, I always forget how to say it, Lewin Books, that one's gonna be much more like fantasy based. Like it's not even all just novels. There's a lot of like tarot card books. There's a lot of like witchy books, right? So every press is gonna have like a specific editorial aesthetic. Like Red Hen is literary fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, and memoir. And other than that, it's sort of like wild, diverse, unheard of stories. Like that's sort of the general vibe. So we have a fairly big range. A lot of places will like range into one genre, like fantasy fiction only. And going wide and going narrow. It's like everything has its pros and cons. It's just about what you want to do and what you're passionate about and what that press is about. Because they really, every type of book has a different kind of contact. So like sometimes people say to Red Hen, like, oh, can you publish this fantasy genre book? And we'll say, oh, we don't publish fantasy genre. And they'll say, oh, well, you've got to publish this fantasy book. But the truth is that we don't have those, we have not worked on those contacts, right? Like we don't have contacts with all of the fantasy reviewers. We don't have contacts with the fantasy, the librarians who take on the fantasy books. So at every step of the chain, whether it's the sales reps and what they expect from you and what they're used to selling from you, to the bookstores, to the reviewers, in every way, and also just the press's general knowledge. Like every niche is a level of expertise. So the wider you go on what you'll accept, the more sort of shallow the expertise might be, at least in the beginning. It's really hard to be an expert at all things. You really got to pick some sort of niche. So again, right, Red Hen, literary fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, and memoir seems like a lot. But we do have a fairly specific aesthetic and sort of the wildness and the wildness of our stories, maybe. And just like there's just sort of a general wild vibe. I would say books that have not been seen before, like that is at least what we try to do, right? It's all aesthetic. It's like a perfume ad, right? You're just trying to like give off a scent and an idea. And all of this, of course, depends on what kind of press you're at. If you're at a big five, you're at either the big five or one of the imprints of Penguin Random House, Harper Collins, Simon & Schuster, Macmillan Publishers, or Hachette Book Group. And most of the pressers you've ever heard of are either of these five or coming down off of these five, right? So imprints and series. The quick difference between an imprint and a series is that an imprint is going to have a totally different brand identity, right? So like Viking Books. Okay, Viking Books is an imprint, right? People think of that as its own big thing, but it's really an imprint of the big five. So I mean, it's like Hyundai or whatever. They all just have like a whole different vibe. Like they're all made from the same car companies, right? But each of them has a different vibe, different aesthetic, different audience. So an imprint has its own brand, usually its own editor, sometimes its own staff. Kind of depends on how hard or soft that goes. But definitely, more or less, some part of it is organized outside of the main press. A series is within that press and like might also include branding from that series. But would still be of like the main publisher on the spine would still be Red Hen Press or would still be Penguin Random, right? So you get the benefit of both, but yeah. There are academic publishers, right? University publishers, those will generally expect far less from authors out of promotion and are going to do things that's more or less, people get published for all sorts of reasons, right? For fame, for fortune, not for fortune, for fame, attempts for fortune, or for tenure. A lot of publication is really for, when I say tenure, I mean for career, but really for tenure, right? If you're working for tenure, you've got to be publishing books, publishing articles all the time. Which is, I think, why there are so many university presses. There's also, in terms of independent publishing, there's for-profit publishing and there's non-profit publishing. So again, right, you can imagine the editorial aesthetic is going to change dramatically for each of these. If it's for-profit, then of course you're way closer to looking at that bottom line, picking the profit projects that are going to take it out. And if you're nonprofit, it doesn't mean that you don't make any profits. You still have to make at least 50% of the revenue from sales. But you do get to wiggle a little more, maybe experiment a little bit more, maybe do more social justice, maybe do more books that are less profitable, not because they are less deserving of praise or work or promotion, but because they're just a little bit more niche than is profitable, right? Like when I publish a book, if I publish a big novel, just a big historical novel, that is going to sell way more than poetry by a lesbian poet in San Diego. That's very specific, but it's just, there's going to be a smaller, first of all, there's fewer people that read poetry, fewer people that are specifically going to choose a lesbian poet, but the people who do choose that book are the ones who really, really need it. And that is why nonprofit publishers especially exist and indie publishers exist, to fill that need and to accept those books from the authors who need to be heard and to fill that need for the readers who need to get those books. And then we get to the actual writing and editing itself. So in terms of how all this works with the editor, I'll say where the editor plugs in. So number one, the writer is alone writing, right? Obviously, all by yourself. That's only step 1 out of 6, though. Some people think that's the whole thing. Step 2 is the writing group and peers. So you're not necessarily paying someone at that point. This is not necessarily your family, right? They're either going to be way too hard or way too soft on their feedback. So I definitely recommend peers, classmates, writing group, something like that. Someone who you trust, maybe vaguely biased because you know them, but some amount of trust. Step 3 is having a professional edit your work. You will often be paying for that. Ideally, honestly, you're paying for that to some degree, unless you really have like a trade happening with a totally unbiased editor. But you really want someone who actually really doesn't know you that well to edit your work, so they don't have the context of you or your life, and they're giving you a really objective view of what the reader is going to see, and what the acquisition editors are going to see when they're looking at your book and considering it for acceptance. So once that's all good to go, that is when you want to start submitting your work. I will say you can also, of course, be submitting smaller pieces along the way, like short stories, a poem here and there, essays here and there. You can always be submitting those to journals, reviews, newspapers, magazines, sorts of things. And sometimes you'll get more, sometimes depending on how much you're paying for the submission, you might get some extra feedback for those. So it's kind of nice to figure out like, wow, like, people really liked this one short story, I should focus on that. Or no, people keep rejecting this one that I thought was really good. So that you focus more editorial attention on that piece. So then it goes into acquisition editing. So this is sort of a wiggly one in terms of whether it's pre or post publication. So sometimes an agent or an author at this stage will say like, oh, great manuscript, let's take it as is and send it to an editor. Or they'll say like, oh, we have some work to do, let's do some developmental editing on this before we even send it out for submission, right? If you're talking to an agent. But in general, at the point that it gets to the acquisitions editor, they're either going to say like, I love it, I'm taking it, or they might say, of course, assuming that they don't say no, they might say, I love it, I'm taking it as is. They might say, I love it, I will publish it if you change fill in the blank. I don't like the ending, I think the climax is weak, I think that this author needs to be filled out, or this character needs to be filled out more. But they might give either a conditional acceptance, which means we are accepting it on the contractual condition that you change this part of the storyline. Or they might just say, we'd love for you to change this part of it, but I'm not going to make it a condition of the acceptance. We're accepting it, and then we'll work on more developmental editing, and maybe you give more time for that. But it also could be acquisition editing could be as simple as we'll take it, like great job, and that at that point, the acquisition editing is done, then the book has been accepted, and then you're going into developmental editing, right? So that's, just if it's not acquisition, if it's not a conditional acceptance, hopefully it's not too heavy-handed of an edit, but it will have some amount of editing. Like I've had books that I went through that like the climax was weak. Like you think like, my God, if that's true, how is the book going to make it? But weirdly, there was just like one addition to the scene that she added in that sort of like popped it off, like took off the steam and allowed you to sort of enjoy the finality of the book. So it can weirdly, most often it's the ending is a little bit weak, like something didn't wrap up quite nicely, or the ending was just very strange, like it ended on a note that didn't fit the vibe of the story in general. A lot of times the title will change at this stage. I'd say not every time. I don't want to say a quarter of them, but I'd say depending on any year, it could be as much as 25%, maybe not that high, but every year there's at least a few titles. Like the title is just super weak. Like I think we had a book once, like the title was going to be like Against the Canon, like that was the submitted title. And like, not that that's a bad title, but marketing wise, like just try to Google Against the Canon and find anything, right? You're not going to find a book. You're not going to find anything that you're looking for unless you type Against the Canon by this author, 2020 or whatever. So marketing in terms of titles, it's not just about if it sounds pretty, it's about whether it's findable on Google, right? And then once developmental editing is completely done, that is when the book goes into copy editing. Some people get those mixed up, but developmental editing, the very black and white description is that developmental editing is vaguely a matter of opinion. Of course, there's organizational structure, but like really it's sort of an opinion. Like you can't necessarily, like you have to write your reasons. You should do this because blah, 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 blah. right? In copy editing, you make the mark with proofreader's mark, and you can pick up your, Chicago manual style and point to the exact reason why you did it. Everything with copy editing, you should be able to point to the Chicago manual style and say, this is why I made that edit. And then of course, proofreading is once the book has been laid out and it's a galley. Let's see if I have a galley super handy. All right. So this is a galley. And so proofreading would mean going through it. Usually it's a manuscript. You could do it as a galley as well, and seeing how it looks on the page, right? Make sure there's no, like this is a perfect example of something that needs proofreading. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this, but right here, there's a letter, right? Dear Tim, blah, blah, blah. And then up here, what is this? This little, I believe that's called a, what is that? I believe that's called a widow. Widows and orphans. I get them mixed up sometimes, but I'm pretty sure this is a widow. Right? So there's just like one little line all by itself, and that is a proofreading mistake. That is something that a proofreader would say, like, nope, like let's change something so that it comes up to the bottom of its letter and it stays together. It's especially important with poetry, but just anything that is going to stop the reader and distract them is what you want to pull out, right? Generally, interiors want to be pretty minimalist. So that's writing and editing. I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions? I'm going to jump into a little bit of a deeper dive now. John, what's up?
Yeah, so I was wondering, as the actual, writer or author, while we're composing our manuscripts or while we're drafting or while we're working on our writing, how much should we be aware of those like widows and orphans and those little formatting issues and things like that? Because I find myself sometimes obsessive. I'm like writing a page and like I'm really into the zone, and then some line gets flubbed on the next page for whatever reason. And I know it's just on my own word processing, so it's not going to look that way in the future, but it just it bothers me. So I just sit there and I'm like, okay, how can I fix this? But should I even be wasting my time worrying about that sort of thing?
Not a bit. Don't even worry about it. Yeah, not even a little bit. I mean, put it on the page the way you want it, right? I mean, put it on the page. So when I say the way you want it, I mean, like if it was poetry, you might want to make that more clear, but really it's just like, this is an 8.5 by 11 sheet, right? Your book is going to be a 6 by 9. If it's poetry, I should say.
Yeah.
It will almost certainly be 6 by 9. So no matter what you do, I mean, like even if you went so far as to change your margins to 6 by 9, like you would have to ask your publisher what their print margins are, and it's different left to right. So really don't there's truly no reason to do that for any reason. I'm not saying like, oh, don't, save yourself the trouble, or, oh, they'll do it for you. They're literally going to take every bit of text from your Microsoft Word document and import it into InDesign. So like none of that will matter. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Nancy, actually, no, there are other ones. I would say that for most literary publishers, regular, whatever, reading book publishers, it is definitely going to be Chicago manual style. But I believe some do APA, like if they do more sociological, if you're doing more textbooks or psychology, there are other things that get used. I think a lot of us used MLA coming up, and as far as I understand, MLA is not really used in publishing. It's very sad. It's definitely shaken my confidence as a copy editor. Makes me a little nervous. But yeah, I definitely grew up on MLA, and I am now still adapting to CMS. But really, it's mostly footnotes and endnotes and that sort of thing. Yeah, totally. And Marianne.
Yeah, I wanted to remind you if you could please put those books in the chat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I wasn't able to write all of them down.
You know what? Actually, I think I have them listed.
Thank you.
Tobi, if you send it to me, I'll put it up on the Culturama community page too.
Oh, cool. All right. That's a pretty good list. I think they got them all. Yeah, there you go. I lost the italics, but it's all good. All right. Okay, cool. Any questions before I get a little deeper? All righty. So, right, acquisitions is what most people want to talk about. And for acquisitions, of course, you want to turn in the best manuscript you have. That's why I recommend going through steps 1, 2, and 3 of the writing and editing process first. I have heard many people say you need to expect at least 100 rejections before you'll get published. That is just kind of a matter of how it is. It's not like people are rejecting your work because your work is bad, right? Like Red Hen can accept 25 books a year. Gray Wolf can only accept 40 a year. Even the big five, everyone has a limit. The amount of like books to be published and books that can be published in any given year, like the ratio is terrible, right? It's like dating during the gold rush. It is really bad. It's very difficult. I know I have a lot of dating metaphors, but they really do play out well in publishing. So it kind of is like that. You're building relationships, you're building trust, and you're doing a lot of work together as partners. But really, expect 100 rejections at least. I've heard that. I learned that from one of our interns. I heard one intern saying like, oh, I just got rejected. And I say my story got rejected for the 10th time. Like, I can't believe it. I thought this was really good. And my friend was like, 10 times? You've got to get rejected 100 times before you even got a chance. Like, what are you worried about? And my favorite piece is that everyone knows, I think a lot of people know that Harry Potter was rejected 12 times before it got published. But what else was rejected 12 times was The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. So 12 people passed up the Pulitzer Prize winning Sympathizer. And if you have not read that book, I recommend it. That's one of those. I was reading the book and I was like, oh, gotcha. Pulitzer Prize winning quality. Like that is what that feels like. Really well written. Anyway, rejected 12 times, just go for it, right? It's just like, if you're at a bar, again, dating stuff, but if you're at a bar and you're shooting your shot with person after person, like 50% of them are taken, the other 10% of them are gay, or if you're gay, 90% of them are straight, right? The amount of like misses for no reason that has anything to do with you is huge. Like before you even get to like actual compatibility and matching, and you both like, you have a book and they have space for a book, right? It's just like a huge amount of time put into that. So just don't give up. That's it. That's the only rule. If you want to get published, do not give up and keep working at it. So the ways to get published. There are, of course, general submissions, which are not available with all publishers. But there are many publishers, including Red Hen, including some other big indies, and lots of smaller indies that take unsolicited submissions. So general submissions, obviously, right? You go to Press's page, you see their submission page, you click it, you try to submit. There are also agented submissions, which is the only way to get into the big five. If you want to be a big five author, you have to have an agent. Getting an agent is almost as much work as getting published anyway. Maybe not exactly, but it is pretty difficult. An agent is going to get roughly 15% of what you make. They are, I'm going to say basically, I don't want to give any absolutes, basically the only way to get into big five publishing. And they're there for you, more or less, as long as you're making them money. I say more or less because I've met agents who are wonderful and who are there for an author's career, whether they're, quote, making money or not. But a lot of authors, keep in mind, they're going to big five only because big fives are the ones who give big advances, which pay the agents who are doing huge amounts of work. It's almost like real estate where you have to show 100 houses before you get the deal. That's kind of what they're doing. They're showing books 100 times before they get the deal, and they're making relationships, and they also have a reputation to uphold. Oh, that agent always has really good novels by women, or God, this agent's always giving me these favor manuscripts. What is this? Every agent has to be making their own choices for their own business practices. So yeah, getting an agent can be tricky, but once you have one, they're on your side. They help you with contracts. They help educate you as the author for what's going on, and they also help sort of make the blow gentler between author and publisher. There is obviously a lot to learn about publishing and editing in general, which is why the big five don't want to work directly with authors. A lot of panic, a lot of why does my cover look like this? Why does my cover look like that? And the publisher doesn't want to say it's in your contract, we do whatever we want with your cover. The agent will say that very softly and gently to you, right, in a good moment. And then, of course, there are awards. Awards are a really good way for debut authors to get published. So that can be a fiction award. There's there's all sorts of awards out there, but they're all what I mean is a publication award. So they're blind. They're blind meaning that you submit, but your name is stripped out of it and your bio is stripped out of it. So first, there's a whole bunch of readers reading your manuscript with you don't have to have a bunch of publications already, right? They're doing it based just on the quality of your work. They pass it to a judge chooses one out of say 10. And then not only do you get book publication, but you generally get a cash award with it, sometimes a residency if it's a really nice fancy award. But yeah, it's a nice way to like slip into publishing without having a lot behind you already. Because in terms of general submissions and agency submissions, they're not just looking at your work, they're looking at you and your bio and your website and your presence on social media and the list of publications you already have. And if we have time, I'll go over how to get more of that. But yeah. So yeah, 3 ways to get published: awards, general submissions, agency submissions. And then once you get accepted, I won't go fully into contracts. Contracts get a little deep. But just in general, I'll just say things out loud. And if you have questions, I can answer them specifically. But contracts, right? There's rights, who gets what rights. So when you're getting published, you're saying like, please publish my book in English in the US. And then the publisher will say, great, we would also like to be able to release it internationally in English. And we'd also like the rights to possibly get it published in other languages in other countries by other publishers, or audiobook rights, or ebook rights, or dramatic rights, right? If it's going to be a show or a movie, which is really, really difficult. So all those rights are things that you're going to negotiate in the contract process with the author or with the agent. And my general rule for that is whoever retains the rights should be the person who can do the most with them, right? So if you have an agent who is fantastic and has got connections in 5 different countries and translators and publishers who are just ready for this book, then that agent should have those rights in those countries because they're already ready to go. I would say it really depends. Again, everything's case by case, but on that one, it really, really depends on the publisher, the author, the book, and the agent. Just depends on what everyone has. Like Red Hen, sort of not, I mean, it was hard work, but Red Hen has relationships with 2 non-exclusive film rights agencies. That is very uncommon. Most publishers do not have a direct relation with film rights agencies, but we're in Los Angeles. So it's like one of the few bonuses of trying to be literary in Los Angeles. But all of these things, audiobooks more or less generally stay with the publisher, but point is if the rights stay with the publisher, everybody wins. Financially, everyone wins, right? If it sells, if the publisher knows what they're doing and they sell the rights, they get split with the author or with the agent and the author. If the agent retains the rights and sells, say the movie, then the agent and the author gets the money specifically, right? They're the only ones who get the money. That's all good because the books are still going to sell more. The publisher makes more money. Like still everyone wins, right? It's kind of like no matter where the split is, if anybody wins, everyone wins. Even if the agent is the one who sells the rights specifically in Germany, that is going to help the publisher sell the rights in France because they can say, we already just sold the rights in Germany, right? So again, rising tide all around here. In terms of advances, right? Editors. So this is, again, all of this are things editors have to think about and talk about and figure out, like contract. Like I've had, when I was the person doing acquisitions for a manuscript, I've had them say, like, great, you said you really like this manuscript. How much do you think we should offer? And I'll say, well, it's really good, but this is a little bit of, this isn't their strongest work. If we lose this one in particular, I wouldn't mind. So don't offer more than, don't offer more than 1,500, but if you have to, give up audiobook rights for it. Or I'll give some recommendation based on the quality of the work, the analysis of the social media and the internet presence of the author. And we'll sort of at that point decide, and when we say the advance, it's not like, oh, you're worth 1,500. Really what you're doing is betting on how much you think the book is going to sell, because it's an advance, right? It's like if you started a new job and you're like, I'm going to do so well here, I want you to pay me for the next 2 months up front. And the company would be like, all right, that's weird, but fine. You can have your first 2 months of upfront. And they're sort of betting, obviously at that point, the company would be betting that you're going to produce that much, right? So really in advance is just a big bet. Sort of, it's both a bet of how much you think the book is going to publish and therefore a safe bet to pay them in that much in advance. And it's also to the author an indication of how much the press, of how well the press thinks the book is going to do. Really, it's, yeah, how well they think it's going to do and how hard they're going to work on it. But of course, all of that is informed by the size of the publisher. Like a smaller press might love the absolute hell out of your book, but is not going to be able to offer the $100,000 advance that a big 5 does. It doesn't mean that they like the book less at all. It just means that $100,000 advance means that they have a huge advance reserve fund that they're pulling out of and putting back into as those books do well, right? So all this is dependent on that. But again, people get really caught up in the advance. It's just an advance on royalties. Once the royalties hit that advance amount, you'll get royalties anyway. So if you had no advance, you would get royalties all the way through, just the same amount. It's not like you get more or less. It's all based on book sales. Yeah, so in terms of royalties, there's kind of a range. At the big five, it's generally like 5 or 6% for trade paper, 15% for case bound. If you go to an indies, it might be closer to like 10% for paperback, 15% for case bound. And there's also something called escalating royalties, which is sort of helpful for the author, sort of like encouraging, right? Like it's 10% for the first 5,000 copies, but once you sell more than 5,000 copies, then it'll be 12%. If it's over 10,000 copies, then you get 15%. Sort of just like extra encouragement, right? Yeah. And then in terms of the split for audiobooks, ebooks, dramatic rights, translation rights, it's all according to the contract. There's really no like necessarily a standard. Could be 10%, 25%, 50%, 75%, really just goes back and forth. Royalties. All right, I'll do this one really fast because I think it's important. So we haven't talked about distribution yet. Distribution is about marketing, right? When we print these books, like we do not call every bookstore and every library manually to let them know we have the book. We're first of all like on the internet, right? Everything you see on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and all of that, that is like metadata that we are creating and spreading out. And in the same way, we create books and they have to be given to a distributor to physically be spread out everywhere. And I say that for the context of net royalties. So when people talk about royalties, right, the author gets 10%. People think that means 10% of retail price, but it's very often not. And I'll explain exactly why. So let's say it's a $20 book. Really easy math here. I'm just going to use super basic percentages. But if it's a $20 book, right off the bat, that book, so we're going to work backwards, right? Book is purchased by the reader for $20, which means that the bookstore bought it 50% off because they've got overhead and they've got employees and they've got bills. So the bookstore bought that book for $10, which means the distributor received that $10 and the distributor is going to take roughly 25%. So they take $250, that leaves $750, presumably, right? That's going back to the publisher. But first you have to subtract shipping fees, warehouse fees, any other fees associated. If there are returns can be up to 40% of inventory of the total for a book, and there's return fees, and that gets all averaged in. So again, easy math. Let's assume that all those fees clip off $250 per book, and you're back down to $5 that actually go back to the publisher, $5 per book. And the 10% of that $5 is what's going to go to the author. And that might seem low, and it does seem kind of low. First of all, it adds up, right? In this math, that means the author is getting 50 cents per copy sold. And of course, that adds up pretty quickly. Even 1,000 copies, right, goes up pretty quickly. But that $4.50 for the publisher is meant to back cover, right? They've already invested all the time. They've already invested a year to 2 years of time, all the staff time, all the production, the designers, the permissions, the printing, the marketing, the media, right? Everything, all of those people, all that time, all that advertising, all of that is covered by that $450 per book. And keep in mind that printing itself, even if it's only 1,000 copies, the printing is going to cost $3,000. So while it adds up, the 50% adds up, more or less quickly or slowly for the author, that $450 is meant to cover a huge amount of work on the publisher's end, and all the investment of time and printing. And sometimes it doesn't, which is why you have to have a balance. Some books do not break even on that huge investment, but they do add to the editorial aesthetic and the sort of the the branding, the optics of the company itself. Yeah. So, right. So in terms of you get into editorial, it's been acquired, right? You've got the contract in, acquisitions editing is done because the book is done, you've got it. Then you go to developmental editing. That's with your assigned editor, your chosen editor, or just the main managing editor who, right, if we're talking about a smaller press, is doing everything we've talked about by themselves, more or less. Because to be honest, when I said those three people that start a press is the designer, the editor, and the business person doesn't usually exist. They're sort of being balanced between the editor and the designer. And designing takes a lot of work, so the editor might be doing that business as well. So now we're at developmental editing. Going with that main editor, sometimes like we've had work that was like so deep in a specific like background, like let's say if the author was Native American and was talking specifically about their culture and their story as a Native American person, we would get a Native American editor for that work. Because that is like we at Red Hen would do that. I'm not saying all places would do that. But this is the stage, developmental editing, where you really want someone who's passionate about the work and who understands it to work on the work. And that applies for freelance as well. If you have a freelance editor, you really want to make sure that they care about your work. Doesn't mean they have to be an expert in it, but they at least should hopefully be interested in it, right? Like let's say, if they're an environmental activist and your book is all about oil and like harvesting oil, that's probably not the best editor. Because even if they say like, oh, I'm unbiased, I can do this, like their whole world view is sort of against what you are writing, and therefore they're not going to be bringing their best editorial vision to your work. You want someone who believes in your work and who's going to edit into your style, not against your style. Not say like, oh, well, people want such and such, like represent the book as it is, right? So developmental editing, which then follows by copy editing with the editorial team, where the team sends you queries. Queries, again, you just say yay or nay. There's some house style or basic changes that are made without queries, like proper ellipses, changing straight to curved quotation marks, yada, yada. So again, in a big house, the editor's job stops here. The smaller the house gets, the more hats the editor is wearing. So the editor might be informing the production and the design of the book, right? So at the point that the developmental and copy editing is complete, that is when it's laid out into a book, into InDesign, and for the purposes of first creating a galley. So at this point, only proofreading should be happening. So there's always a stage that an author says like, oh, like I want to include another essay, or I just want to like change this or add an extra page to that. And at that point, you are just ruining lives. Because at that point, it's not just like, oh, I'll cut this out of a manuscript. You are cutting it out of a design, which means that everything from that page forward has to be redesigned, especially if it's poetry. Let's see if I can grab the poetry. Here we go. So especially if it is poetry. So some places do static margins. Sad. If you're doing poetry, I always recommend dynamic margins, and that's the best example of why it's hard to plug things in once it's already laid out. So these are dynamic margins, right? So static margins would start all the way over here in the corner, just like a novel, right? 1 inch, everything's like, this is in the gutter, that's all the way to the edge. Dynamic margins for poetry are based off the longest line in the poem. So this one actually, okay, so they didn't count this one because it's the beginning part. But the longest line in this poem is going to be how it gets centered on the page. And the point of that, sounds a little odd, it'll shift around. It is a lot of extra trouble. But the point of it is that when the reader is reading the book, they should not notice the text. They shouldn't notice the font. They shouldn't notice the layout at all. If the interior is doing its job, all it's doing is bringing you to the work itself and nothing else. So that's the sort of thing, like this is a really big one. So that one's way deeper into the margin. You can see that the more I flip around, here's the little one, right? Again, biggest one in the middle. And that is one of the small examples for why at the point that it's laid out, you really want to only be doing proofreading. You really do not want to be entering more content. And that can be a lot earlier from the pub date than authors will understand. People will be like, it's, how could it be too late? It's 9 months before the pub date, but it's because they're creating a galley. It's because we are creating these that have to be printed and sent around the country a full 5 to 6 months before the book even comes out. Because in order for this book to do well, people have to know about it before it comes out, right? It's like a movie. You don't find out about a movie on the release date. You find out about it months and months before. So people buy tickets, people buy pre-order tickets so that the theaters can get the films in time, so that theaters can be interested enough to order the films and receive them in time. So this whole book has to be basically laid out with almost completed by 6 months before the pub date. And of course, the editor is going to be pretty involved in that. They want it to look as good as it possibly can before it's sent out to every bookstore, to every reviewer. And if 6 months seems early, it's not just like, oh, we want people to know about it. It's because we are sending them to, to Publishers Weekly, to Library Journal, the Book List, to all of these magazines who are going to produce reviews, who of course are themselves publishers. They need time to receive a book, to decide which ones to review, to write the reviews, and to put them in their own layout and their own design that has to be printed and mailed around the country, just like ours need to be printed and mailed around the country, which is why there are many reviewers. Book List being probably the most important and notable of them. Book List and Publishers Weekly, maybe, that if you don't get it to them 4 months before publication, you've missed it. They will not review your book. It's already missed their editorial window, which is why. And they must have to turn them around so fast because, there's only so much a publisher can do. 6 months before pub is already kind of a lot. Especially considering how fast times are moving nowadays and how close you want content to be to the times. Yeah, it's definitely a quick turnaround on the marketing. Yeah, dynamic margins. And of course, there's cover design. Editors have a lot to do with cover design, either writing notes, this is what we think should be on the cover, this is how it should be represented, these are different themes you could pull. Because if you just give a designer a book description, that's not necessarily going to help them in the same way. You might want to specifically, like sometimes notes will say like, this is a religious book, but the author does not want religious imagery on the cover at all because it's disrespectful in this way, like whatever it is. We have like really, really tight editorial. In fact, here's one that's really specific. This one had a lot, weirdly, a ton of input when it came to covers. This one right here. And that is because, let's hear a fiddle. That is because, so right, so Subduction, it is a book about Native American reservation. And so we were very careful. In fact, when we first started, there was all this text on the bottom, like her name was on the bottom, the blurb was on the bottom. And then when we showed the image of the author, she was like, whoa, like this is Native American land. Like my name cannot be stamped across Native American land on the cover of my book. So we ended up actually redesigning the whole thing to keep all of this completely clear of text and bring everything up, so there'd be nothing off, right? So it can be that detailed and cultural in terms of the edits, or it can just be the basic stuff, like be careful with purple and green. Depending on the shade, people will not buy it. I don't know what it is, but purple and green, you got to be kind of careful with. You can imagine, right? There's shades of purple, shades of green that look kind of weird on a cover. Maybe look super 80s, make it look like a car paint. And also you have to be aware of the times, right? Right now it's really heavy on typography, big graphic designs, really minimalist, but like big font stamped across the front of it. And part of that is because you want to be able to read a book 6 feet away. So like this one's actually kind of on the edge. I don't know what 6 feet away is for you guys, but right, it's like kind of on the edge. I really have no idea what 6 feet is in this way, but you really want, like this one's a perfect example. Even if it's kind of far away, you can see what that says. Oh, there's my bookmark. This one too, right? Great font, great title, really far away, but also would be really shoddy for a novel, right? This is very clearly an informative textbook style book. This one is trying to look cool, but it still looks like a textbook, right? Yeah, you can tell. You can tell just glancing at it. And there's things like that. Like this one could be a nonfiction, but this one kind of feels like a novel. Right, this one definitely feels like a novel. You can just glance at it, right? So in terms of an editor is going to inform like sort of the theme of it, but also might say like often I will say like, hey, that's a cool cover, but like that looks way too YA. Like the font is just a little too bubbly, or the colors are a little too bright, or there's just something about it that somehow metaphorically vibes a different genre that you're not looking for. And then of course, like I said about the title's got to be good. We once had a book, oh my goodness. We once had a book that the original title that was entered in was Dog Relations. And it was about somebody whose life had been saved basically emotionally by her 3 dogs. But it was something like Dog Relations, like an interspecies family. And just the way that played out on the page was just not something we wanted to publish. It just looked a little, it just didn't vibe well. So that was one that we definitely changed to something else that made way more sense. I'm afraid to say it because the title was so bad. We've just had so many, I'm trying to think. we've had so many different titles change. That's maybe my best example. Dog relations and interspecies family is not the vibe you want to give to a memoir about losing your husband, right? It's just like not the vibe. Oh, and then of course, the most basic one, the bigger celebrity, the bigger the name on the book, right? If it's a Stephen King book, they just put the title really small up top and they just put Stephen King right off, right? Sort of kidding, but really, the bigger the name, the bigger the celebrity. And sometimes you'll sort of do that just to like kind of be like, hey, pay attention to this author. You know, sometimes you just see a big name and you think, wow, this person must be famous, right? But for the most part, you use that as a tool to like bring people in just from the name. And again, the smaller the company, the more they get involved into all of this, like marketing. We'll do marketing really briefly, but basically with marketing and the formats. So the editor, it kind of depends on the press on what part of this is balanced with who. Depending on it, like the marketing people might create all of the copy. Sometimes the editor themselves who acquired it creates all the copy. Generally, we try to start with the author, like, hey, author, like, you know, give us a description of your book, and we'll start with that. Because not only because, of course, they know their book better than anyone, but I really want to know how they want their book to be represented. And then we will shift that to be more, just be better for marketing purposes, right? Like what one person thinks is the coolest thing about their book, it might be the coolest thing about their book, but you still need to insert a really flashy line to bring the reader in to buy the book, right? So in terms of things that, again, so there's the author bio. So when we get the manuscript, when I say final delivery, like this is the deadline for your final delivery, meaning the manuscript with no other changes to be made, no other edits to be submitted, like the final manuscript. We also ask for their bio, a shortened main description, all the places that they have lived or worked or gone to school around the country. Because again, we're sort of going to mark those out for marketing and tell our sales reps, this person used to go to college in Chicago, which means that those bookstores are going to try a little harder to stock those books. That university's bookstore is going to want to stock those books for like alumni who are now authors, right? Like all those relational things help with the promotion, right? Planned tour, alternate book formats, blurbs. Blurbs are really important. Blurbs are both really important and difficult to get because you cannot, if you pay for them, it's a little unethical, right? You're paying someone, you can't pay for somebody's good opinion on your book. It's not really how you want to do that. You want somebody who loves your book well enough to bother reading it and then giving you a marketable 3 lines of, you know, this impressively comprehensive and revealing analysis of the structures and processes of modern publishing as timely as the industry faces its digital future, right? So that's actually a review, but that just as well as a blurb. A blurb is really a review from a person, not necessarily from an entity. And they're one of the top things that sell your books. And it's a really big favor. You want to give the biggest person, like the biggest name you possibly have on your list to do you a massive favor. And that is how you get blurbs. And a lot of places, a lot of people just don't even give blurbs anymore. Because as you can imagine, it's a lot of trouble, right? You're doing it for free. You're just doing it in your free time. You know, asking somebody for I like to think of that as when I think about favors you ask in the publishing industry, think about how much time you're really asking of them, right? A lot of people, if you're an editor or if you're trying to get a favor from an editor, will say like, oh, like, I know you're an editor. Would you mind editing my manuscript for me? Just keep in mind, you were asking for what, a 6-hour favor, a 9-hour favor? People sort of think it's just like a quick thing they can do in their sleep, but really properly reading a manuscript is going to take at least 5 hours. So again, asking for a blurb is like asking for, I don't know, it depends on the reading speed, but you're asking for somewhere between a 3 and a 5-hour favor. So, you know, give them, you don't have to pay them, but like chocolate, cookies, dinner, these are the sorts of things, right, that you can do. Not bribery, just thank yous. Truly, I'm not kidding. No bribery. You've really got to get an honest and ethical review. Let's see, comp titles, that's a whole thing. But one of the things you really have to know as an editor, especially, and again, you think this is marketing, but really it's the editor, the most well-read, most familiar with the manuscript, who has to figure out comp titles. And that means a book that's been published in the last 2 to 3 years of the same genre, of the same like sales estimate that sort of is going to create a Venn diagram. Like when I'm pitching a book to someone, I'm not going to say, oh, this is like the next Harry Potter. Everybody thinks it's the next Harry Potter. fodder. What you want to say is like, this is just like these 3 other books that just came out where you can look up their sales and see how well they did. And it's not even necessarily about the content, more about the vibe. I think about it as like 3 similar books that were a Venn diagram, and your book is sort of in the middle, right? That's sort of like what you're trying to present to people. Yeah, pointing to a previous success for how this book is going to do. And then of course is figuring out the pricing, right? Whatever the pricing is in USD and Canada and pounds, if it's an internationally published, all around the world. That's super fun. Sales rights, which all depends on contracts and who got what and where. And then again, the editor often has to figure out the book pitches. And this is, or in fact does book pitches. So at Red Hen, the managing editor who does these books, like I go with the managing editor to Winter Institute, which is one of the main conferences where we basically meet with 800 booksellers around the country and pitch our top 8 books of the year over and over and over for hours. We talk to a group of 10 people at a time, 6 times a day for 2 days. And you just pitch the same 8 books over and over and over and over. And so in those versions, we're doing the full 2-minute pitch. So when you're writing book pitches for how you're going to get your book sold to a bookseller or to anybody, you have a 2-minute version, a 1-minute version, and a 20-second version, right? 20-second is like if you're at a book fair, if you're in an elevator, quick pitch, just like here it is in 1 line. If they're kind of interested, maybe you give them the rest of the 1-minute version. And if they're really interested, or you get time to do a full pitch, 2 minutes max. You'll notice I said nothing more than 2 minutes. And that's because if they're not in it there, they're not going to buy the book. You can move on. Book pitches. Already went a little bit over distribution. And then again, depending on the editor, like they might be involved in all the events, setting up readings, festivals, conferences, writing long read pitches, which is really like op-eds where you pick anywhere between 3 and 7 topics that you can write about as a writer that has everything or nothing to do with your book. What matters is that at the end of the essay, it will say written by author of blank, that includes a link where you go and buy that book. And those pitches are things that you like. So you don't write the whole article, you just write ideas, right? Like, how to grow tomatoes in Washington under the shade of a tree. That's very, very specific. But whatever you are super expert about, again, whether it's closely related or not related to your book, you just get ideas, like a list of like 7 ideas, and then you send those as pitches first to the New York Times, because they give you a 48-hour turnaround for a yes or no. Then I think you go to, I'm forgetting the second one now. There's like a couple in order. One gives you like 24-hour turnaround, one gives you 72-hour turnaround. And then after that, then you can just send it out to everyone at once. Yeah, John.
Who do you send that to?
You send that to like New York Times, Chicago Tribune, like all the places, anywhere that has op-eds, right? Like it could be your local one, right? Like you do the Los Angeles Times. They actually are publishing a lot more literary like related articles lately. So that might be a good one. But yeah, really like New York Times, New Yorker, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, you just like go through all of those. But yeah, the ones that do op-eds.
But whose name do you send it to? Like
whose names? That would depend on the one, obviously. Generally there'll be a listed one, like if you are sending something in, send it to this editor. They'll make it very clear. There'll be like a main editor who goes through all of those, or at least they have a reader reading that email who goes through all of those and then sends that up. And again, rejections there have nothing to do with you. Like for the last, previous to fall of 2020, nobody would publish anything that wasn't political. Like New York Times was like, if you can put a political bent on that, we can take it. But other than that, we're not going to publish any articles like that. So that's one of the best. So the article writing is actually one of the best ways that you can get promotion before publication and after publication, because you can just write it. It just gets you more, just like a different avenue, different location. And it does not require, like they don't care if you published a book, they care if you have a good idea and it's well written. And then for those ideas, just to be super clear, you don't write the whole article, right? You write 2 to 3 sentences for each of those topics. And then when you do send it around, they will tell you, the New York Times will say, I really like this idea. I want you to make this 800 words. And actually, can you make it way more about growing any plant under a tree and don't focus as much on tomatoes or whatever it is, right? They're going to give you a really specific size and angle and how fast they want it, right? And that's why, like, the New York Times wants it first because they're the New York Times. They don't want you to say, oh, somebody else picked it up. Like, they want to be the top, right? So that's why they get exclusive look at it. And then you send it to the next one. I can't remember which one it is now. Oh, wait, Wall Street Journal. Is that it? No, it's not. I'll remember it in a second. But there's another one that's 72 hours. Again, they don't want to hear that somebody else took it. They want exclusive rights to look at it first. And then after that, you send it to everywhere. And of course, keep track, because if it does get accepted, you want to tell everyone else, hey, idea 2 got accepted at so-and-so, like, please take that off of your docket. You do not want, if an editor contacts you and says, I would like to publish this book, they've gone through a lot of trouble and a lot of teamwork and a lot of meetings to actually say, we want to accept this, fill in the blank. So you really don't want to tell them, sorry, I forgot to tell you it already got accepted, because they will not want to look at your next work. And again, you want to, like, be a respectful, professional, like, publishing industry person. And then really quick on social media, because this is important for editors who are also represented by social media, and also, of course, writers, authors. You must have a website. Absolutely must have a website. Unless you were famous before the internet was invented, you have to have a website. And even then it's good to have a website. In terms of social media, Facebook, Meta, whatever the heck it is now, is one of the only ones that's good for events. A lot of people don't like Facebook. I should say, if you don't like social media, that's cool. You can technically figure it out. But in terms of publicity, you have events, you have long read pitches, and you have social media. So if you're not going to do one, you got to go really hard on the other 2. So Facebook is, I say Facebook is preferred, mostly because it's just a lot easier to share things with people, right? Like, I don't even know how to share things on Instagram. It's kind of hard. Maybe if you do that daily thing, but in terms of something that stays put, Facebook is really good. And also you can create events, you can invite people to events. It accepts streams of video events, virtual events, which of course are important now and probably forever. Little known fact, I don't know, 20 to 25% of us Americans have a physical disability. There's a really under-hit market in terms of books, first of all, but also just in terms of, like, the whole thing where all these events are now virtual is fantastic. Like, classic curbside effect. Now people who were having trouble leaving their house physically for all of these events, it's a lot of trouble. You drive somewhere, you park somewhere, you go to an event that has, like, no stairs or something, right? So 20% more people are able to do it just for that, let alone the people who just didn't have time to drive to Santa Monica that day, or whatever, right? Or people who just, like, don't live in that city. Like, the amount of access now is fantastic. And again, Facebook is the easiest way to share all of that. Twitter, if you can swing it, I cannot. That's why I just share my Instagram posts to Twitter. Maybe I'll try again at some point. I try every couple of years. Instagram, of course, is great if you can swing it. I'd say Instagram is kind of the easiest because there's not so much pressure on how much you're writing. You can just take a cool picture. And also pictures are fun, right? Pictures of your garden, pictures of your dog, whatever is cool. And also pictures of you now and then, not all selfies, right? There should be some balance. There's other stuff, like if you're writing a cookbook or it's a DIY book or something like that, you could go to Pinterest. I'd say Pinterest is more like project-based books, but can do pretty well. And in general, for all of these social medias, except for Pinterest, Pinterest is its own deal. But for all of these, you want to have no more than 1/3 promotional. So no more than 1/3 look at me and look at my book. Or rather, look at me as an author and look at my book, right? No more than 1/3 of that. No more than 1/3 of event promotion. So that is separate, right? 1/3 being like, here's an event I'm doing, or here's how cool my event was. Look at these pictures. And then, of course, at least 1/3 personal content. So that's you, that's your dog, that's like those cool photos you like to take of shadows, whatever it is, just personal content, some kind of vibe. Even if it's like a tiny bit of a persona, you don't have to show every part of your vulnerable life. Like, figure out what part of your life you are comfortable sharing and authentically represent that part of yourself. Maybe it's a specific hobby, maybe you don't want to put your kids in social media, but you don't mind your dog, or, whatever it is. Just find some piece that you're comfortable sharing about yourself. And then we talked about reviews being 4 to 6 months in advance. Okay. God, there's so much. All right, I feel like I want to just pause for questions anyway. I'll just say briefly that all of this moves into the editor and the author, and if there is a marketing person outside of the editor, that marketing person doing a lot of bookstore outreach, right? So all of this comes down to like Amazon, depending on the publisher, is doing anywhere from 40% of the sales. Like 40% is a low end on how many books are sold from any publisher to Amazon. I've heard of publishing companies that 75% of their sales are on Amazon. And that might seem exciting, right? It's cool, it's Amazon, which is super cool unless you're at the beginning of a pandemic and Amazon decides to stop shipping books for 3 months, right? Like if all your eggs are in any basket, no matter how big or cool or important that basket is, it is one basket. And all it takes is one upend, one server down for whatever period of time to have that source of revenue shut down. So it's important to really focus on all aspects, right? You want to get the libraries, and as an author, you can do that by doing events at libraries. We have an author who published a book in 2015 and never stopped doing events. Like her book just keeps on selling like it did year one because she does bookstores and she goes to the library. She's on the library circuit once a year. She hits the libraries up again. And libraries buy books, they buy books, they send books to they want to have extra copies if they're getting a lot of play, they send books to other libraries. Yeah, what's up, John? John Branningham. Oh, you're on mute.
That's really interesting. How do you get on a library tour? Is that something you do on your
Hey,
own?
just contact.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it depends. So yeah, in all these, if it's that far after publication, it's probably the author doing it themselves, unless you've just got a massively I don't know, marketing team that's willing to follow the author 5 years post-pub. That's not as typical. Oh, that's actually one thing I forgot to mention that's a little depressing sometimes. If you are at a big 5, your book expires 6 weeks after publication. They move on to another book. If you're at an indie press, that is more likely to last at least the whole season, if not the whole year. And an indie press is way more likely to follow you further on. Like if we have an author that we published 3 years ago, but they sent us an article and they're like, hey, I got this great article published. It mentions me being an author of that book. Like we'll put it up on all our channels. We'll put it in the newsletter if it's big enough. We'll put it on social media, right? On anything. A big 5 book is way less likely to do that. Right, a big 5 press is way less likely to do that. So yeah, 6 weeks for a big 5 is something they cut it and move on, unless there's the 1%. There's always the 1% example. Like Michelle Obama, they did not drop that book after 6 weeks. They just kept running it, right? She was like selling out stadiums. So there are exceptions, but yeah, books do, when I say they expire, they just move on. The press might move on to promoting other books because front list, the biggest, newest thing that's selling more. Yeah, so in terms of libraries, bookstores, and really anywhere, like you can just keep doing doing all these events. And I should say, in terms of publicity and touring, again, it's not like I go there, I'm going to sell 30 books, that's going to pay for the tour. It's really more about creating the ripples, creating the waves. So if you go to a bookstore, if a bookstore decides to buy your book, just straight up, looked at a catalog, I like this book, they're going to buy 2 copies of it, only 2 copies of it. And that's it. You did it. You got bought by that bookstore, 2 copies. If they like your book well enough, or it's been reviewed heavily enough, or they're hearing enough about it, they might order 5 copies. And when I can look at sales, 2 copies, great, that book buy it. If I see 5 copies, I know that they put it on a front table display. And that's how I know, like, great, we're on a front table display. But even then, when they sell out of those 5, if I'm lucky, they order another 2 to sit on the shelf, but that might just be it, 5 and done. And then it's special order. So if you do an event, they're going to order anywhere between, depending on the event, somewhere between 20 and 50 copies. And that doesn't mean that a bunch of them won't get returned, depending on who shows up and who actually buys the book and who already had the book and brought it in for you to sign instead, right? But even then, probably going to sell at least 20, which seems like a lot, right? But still, if you look at that whole breakdown, right, it still breaks down 20 times 5 at best, right? Maybe that's $100. But what also is going to happen is the booksellers are going to remember that book. When you leave, they probably will ask you to sign anywhere between 2 and 5 or 10 copies of them, which they will officially buy once they're signed. That's a trick. You can't return it once it's signed. So once they sign it, that is going to stay on their shelf. So not only have you just secured every sale from the event, another 2 to 5 or 10 signed that they're going to buy that are going to sit on their bookshelf. And then that bookseller is going to say for the next month, for the next year, oh yeah, I met this author Marianne Perez, she was fantastic. I loved this book. And then they're going to hand sell it to every single person who walks in that door looking for a book, anything like that one for the next year. So that's really the ripple effect you're looking for events. And then there's tastemaker bookstores. So ones that you would want to go to, you want to do events at, and also ones that publishers should really be doing dedicated mailings to, right? Either of the galleys, like I was showing, 6 months ahead or 3 months ahead. Or just in general, right? Getting samples, getting press releases, getting dedicated emails or catalogs, right? And that's like in Los Angeles, Skylight Books. There's a bunch of them. There's Romans, there's Book Soup, but Skylight's really, I think, I don't know if I want to say Skylight is more famous than Book Soup. I'd say they're both pretty famous. Depends on what you're into, right? Last Bookstore is also pretty cool. Maybe not as friendly as it could be, but that was kind of the vibe there. But Skylight is the really cool one that has a tree growing through the center of it, right? Powell's in Portland, City Lights in San Francisco, which is impossible to get an event there, but Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle, Tattered Cover in Colorado, Green Light Bookstore in Brooklyn, which is the nicest bookstore in New York, by the way. Nicest meaning nicest people. That's actually pretty nice anyway. And then like Politics and Plays in Washington, D.C. These are the bookstores that are tastemaker bookstores. So when they buy a book, other bookstores pay attention to what these bookstores are buying and what they're doing and what they're talking about. So they're really like, they're all indies, but like they're all part of the Independent Book Publishers Association. They're all going to the same meetings. We're all going to the same conferences. So that you really want all these people to be talking about you and your book from all these different angles, because they heard the publisher talk about it at Winter Institute, because the author went into their local store. And those are all tastemakers. But what's really the top most important thing is to go to your local bookstores. Know your local 5, go to them, talk to them, develop relationships, buy books, go to their events, so that when you are a published author, you can say, what up, local bookstore? Here I am, now I have a book. And they will want to host you because you're local and you're cool and you have a good relationship with them. And because everything in publishing is about networking and people. And I know that seems kind of annoying, but there's just so many books and there's such oversaturation that people want to work with people who are pleasant to work with. They're not going to do it just because of numbers. I mean, there's so many books out there, right? Like my to read shelf, it's not a shelf, it's a bookcase. And there's another 100 on my Goodreads list. And there's I know another 20 coming for Christmas, right? And I'm going to do my best to get to them as fast as I can. And so is everybody else. So you've really just got to build those relationships and make sure you're finding the right match. And there's way more detailed things. I'm going to pause there because we need questions. Okay, questions about any of that or anything else that you were hoping I would cover?
Okay. Cindy, that's a question.
Oh, Cindy, can I hear you?
Oh, yeah. Hi.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Toby. Gosh, you covered everything. It's hard to come up with a question, but I have a question. I wrote a children's book under the name Cindy Lou, but now I'm writing a romance novel. And my name is obviously Cindy Neisinger, but I'm going to go by CC Cruz. So how important are pen names, or how do I guess my question is it okay to use it?
Yeah, how important are pen names? I would say if you're going into a different genre, you could definitely change the name. I say if you're sticking with the same genre, you want to try to build up on what you're already having there. But the chances of someone being like, oh my God, this is that children's book author, I should pick this up. Pretty unlikely, I'd say, especially for that genre switch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of people weirdly, Kazim Ali, who's the editor for our newest anthology, also does fiction and poetry and nonfiction and choose your own adventure books and children's books. And he uses the same name for all of them. But that's sort of what he does. I'd say most people don't do all of that. So yeah, for a different genre, I would say that happens. You can definitely do that. How important are pen names? Having follow through with a name, I'd say, is important, right? You want someone to hopefully recognize your name. But what's really most important is assuming if you want to be anonymous, that I've been trying to wrap my head lately around what to do if an author needs to be anonymous, right? And not just anonymous as a name, but like to have a pen name where they will not show up as that pen name to not be discovered or something. That one's a little harder because you'd have to skip events and you'd have to just kind of create a whole, you kind of just have to create a sort of persona around that name. Right? Like how people are gonna you'd have to think about how people are gonna find you and your website. Like maybe you just buy, so if you're like, let's say you're cindylou.com. Sorry, what was your last name?
Neisinger.
Sorry, say it again, Heisinger?
Yeah, Neisinger.
Neisinger, okay, sorry, it's hard to hear.
That's okay.
So maybe you buy, maybe you already have cindylou.com. Maybe you also buy cindyneisinger.com and just have a redirect to the same website where you have both names listed or whatever. If you're not hiding it, there's no reason.
I'm not hiding.
Yeah, there's no reason to worry about that. You just want to think about how you're represented.
Thank you for answering that. I just have one more question.
Yeah.
And you may have covered it before I got here. Sorry, I got here late. What about emails, like email captures? Is that from your website? If you have to build them up, I mean, I've heard that before, that agents want to know that you have this presence and you have people.
Wait, answer that. Ask me
Like
that
to have
question.
like if you need to have like a whole bunch of people that follow you through email.
Through email. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Like,
Oh, right, like an e-blast sort of thing.
Yeah, like an email
Um,
capture when you go to your site and it says, you can get a free chapter and
Oh, interesting. I have not put, I'm sure there are publishers who would really like to see those numbers. I mean, if somebody told me, oh, and I have 1,000 people who follow my newsletter, I would be like, great, that's cool. Let's use that. But I wouldn't think of that as like a requirement. But yeah, that's helpful. If you've got that, why not?
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a few people that do that. CL Jew is actually a really fantastic example of well-run social media. She's like truly made herself a literary citizen in the public sphere. CL Jew. Her Instagram is also a fantastic example of how to be a literary citizen on your Instagram. Like every single day, she takes a picture of like her book and a drink or food or whatever, and she writes a review of the book and tags the author and talks about how amazing it is and how she found out about it. And she does a great job. Yeah, she also has a newsletter that she sends out. That's what made me think of it. She like sends out a newsletter once a month and has this whole following, and she's pretty great.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. John, did you have a question?
I do, but I think Sarah had a question too.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Well, I was just curious about how you're wrestling with the supply chain issues right now, and it may be that's not the thing that we're all, but I just worry about independent publishers and supply chain and like what that means for everybody.
Yeah, that is real. Yeah, I know. I feel like I need an extra half hour for every talk now to explain what's happening during the pandemic. So yeah, that is a great point. So paper has gone up. I mean, there's like weird supply chains anywhere. Like I've had a printer for our office back ordered for 3 months, just a printer, a basic printer, let alone the book printers who are backlogged about 2.5 times what they ever were before. So pre-pandemic, I could get a paperback printed and shipped within 4 weeks. 4 weeks, I would have that book. And now it's 10 weeks. And that does, it's like, 4 weeks, 10 weeks. Well, that's times 25 books over the next 4 years, every single one of which has to now have their whole production timeline pulled up a minimum of 2 months because shipping is taking longer, right? Shipping used to be like a solid 3 or 4 days. Now, sometimes that's 5 or more. I mean, there's so many things like that. Just working from home. It's like a lot of people have moved. We've lost people. I mean, we actually have not lost anyone. We didn't furlough anyone. We didn't lose anyone. But there was like one main, like my audiobook coordinator had to move to take care of his father, right? Like these, even just like really basic personal things like that have really disrupted the industry. And yeah, that is real. Shipping is taking way longer. I used to be able to count on a book shipping out of the warehouse within 2 days. And depending on what's going on now, there could be a 10-day delay on that book going out. And so, yeah, that is a pretty huge deal. And it's made it's been a pretty significant impact. We have luckily sort of pivoted to that. We're a 10-person staff, which seems to be just the right size to pivot hard and fast with a lot of passion and energy and like meet the demand. But like 3 would have been impossible. Even 50, weirdly, like so much more difficult because the amount of wrangling. So we adjust the amount of people to do the work without a massive amount of wrangling to like pivot and like get it done. And, you know, I'll also, as the marketing director and an editor, I will say, you know, sometimes I can sense my production editor is just starting to lose it. And I'll say like, okay, what's going on? What's your project? What are your deadlines? And I'll say like, skip, you know, cut this corner, cut this corner, cut this corner. They're going, these three will be fine. I know these authors, I know they will give them back to you within a week. Like, you know, you don't worry about these taking an extra month. Or like for AWP, right? We try to have all of our books ready ahead of time, unless the author isn't going to be there. And she was like, oh no, I'm going to get them all there. I was, Rebecca, no, these authors will not be there. Push those books back 3 months. Don't torture yourself. So there's a lot of corner cutting and sort of creative ideas that have gone into helping all of that, but mostly it's been a little painful. And we have very gently asked authors for patience. But we haven't missed any deadlines. We've been getting it all, and everyone's been really flexible because everybody is struggling. I mean, really, everyone is struggling. There's no one who has not been hit by this in some massive way. I mean, literally at the point that offices can't just order like a printer to print their manuscripts, you know, there's weird stuff going on. So yeah, we've just been working harder, faster, cutting some corners, leaning some more on print on demand printing rather than printing 1,000 at a time for that big investment that we don't know is going to go as far in still semi-pandemic times. We'll like print fewer and then turn on the print on demand system faster, which literally is print on demand, print to order. Somebody orders the book and then bust it out real fast and print it. It's way higher quality than it ever used to be, and weirdly ships faster because instead of it having to be pulled from this big warehouse in Ohio and then shipped to someone in Los Angeles, the LA printing facility will receive the order, print it within 24 to 48 hours, and then send it out locally within 24 to 48 hours because it's in the state. So there's a lot of weird stuff we figured out like that. Yeah.
Well, we're over time now. Can you take one more question, maybe quickly?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I've got all the time. I'm here for you. Yeah, there was a question. I saw a hand go up. Oh yeah, Mary.
Hi. So do you look at literary journals and what they publish and get authors from there?
We do sometimes. I would say at least we pay attention to it. In fact, we run a literary journal. I haven't even gotten into all our programs. But yeah, we run the Los Angeles Review. Not the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is a separate one. There's many, right? Like New York, there's New York Review, there's New York Review of Books, they're separate. But yeah, we definitely do. I'd say we do look at them. Mostly we look at them if we're looking at a manuscript from the author. We might say like, oh, they also got published by, you know, New York Review of Books. Like, let's see what that looks like. But yeah, you do. You definitely keep an eye on, you like see if a piece looks really amazing. There have definitely been authors. In fact, there's one that we're finally going to publish that I invited to an event, saw some of their work and just like have been like wanting to publish them so badly. And then finally reached out and said, you know, I would love to publish your book. And it was just because I was following their career and they were amazing. And yeah, so it definitely happens. So when we talk about networking relationships, like you literally might just be like seen at an event and be like, wow, that was a performance. Like I want that, you know, and we had specifically like our like biggest performance poet had kind of moved recently when I was first talking to this person, had sort of moved out of the state and wasn't going to be there for our cool local events anymore. So yeah, you can definitely find people in all sorts of ways.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Tobi. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to talk to you all.
Thank you. Okay, so up next we have Linda Hogan, who's going to talk to us about how to write about sex, and she's right there.